thanks for having me. Thanks for the gin yesterday and the beautiful walk through the rain yesterday. It was great. So let's see. I'll talk about graph searches. That's the stuff that I do here. And graph searches have been very common in application to single agent planning, anywhere from ground to aerial to manipulation and so on. And some of the reasons for that is that they have a very nice support for complex cost functions. We basically want to specify a variety of different things on the graph and then search for a solution in that graph. They support arbitrary environments, particularly things that are coming from real perception, where you can model very well, all kind of different obstacles. And they also provide very nice rigorous guarantees. So now, when it comes to the multi-agent planning, multi-robot planning, much less work has been done on applying graph searches to it, but still there are quite a lot of work has been done. And in particular, I think one of the areas that has gotten a lot of interest and a lot of work is a multi-agent, multi-robot path planning, where you're basically planning for a set of robots that are trying to avoid each other, so avoid collisions. But when it comes to kind of a more of a single algorithm that tries to, single graph search algorithm that tries to handle any kind of arbitrary, arbitrary multi-robot planning problems, like for example, something like the bunch of UAVs flying the environment with no-fly zones and trying to hit as many points as possible, or maybe a bunch of robots that are trying to get to their goals while moving things and so on. And if we're talking about a single algorithm that tries to handle any kind of a problem specified in the graph, that is a problem. And essentially the problem becomes due to the fact that you've got to go to the joint state space, which is obviously exponential in the number of robots. So on a problem something like that, where you just have I think it's like 4 UAVs that have to hit the number of waypoints. If you look at a single individual state space for every UAV, then it's just 10 to the 4. So it's a 4-dimensional state space, which is pretty easy to handle with the graph search. Now, if you going to the joint state space, then you're talking about something 10 to the 14, and that becomes immediately too large for it to be just kind of do one single search through one joint state space graph. So that obviously is a problem. That's kind of highly unpleasant. However, the observation that I think we make, and many other folks also make, is that most problems that you're looking at are not arbitrary complex. And what can you do about it? And in particular, one thing that is interesting is that if you look at it as the problem, then it does not, most of the time, it does not require you to plan in a full joint state space. And that fact can be actually exploited. And kind of the way we look at it is how can we take those type of problems and decompose them into a series of easy to solve graph searches. So it's much smaller graph searches that try to kind of exploit the fact that you don't have to do the full joint state space planning all the time. And that leads to much better scalability. It also leads to natural decentralization that I will not talk about. Now, on the research side, obviously, the questions are, how do we do that? So how do we take those problems and how do we find those the decompositions and what guarantees we can provide and under what conditions? So those are kind of the questions that interest me in the context of multi-robot planning. So there are 2 things that I'll talk about. Number one is planning for opportunistic surveillance, and that will be kind of an example of manual decomposition for that particular problem. And then, which I think is kind of much more interesting, I'll talk about how do we go beyond manual decomposition. That is, how can you think about the algorithms that try to find this decomposition automatically. So the first talk, the first part, planning for opportunistic surveillance, that is actually a joint work with Vijay Kumar, and that was done by Dinesh Thakur. So the problem here is you have those UVs, which are shown with those arrows, and they have to navigate to they have to fly to their goal, respective goal locations. There are no fly zones. There is some sort of arbitrary cost function, whether it's a time, maybe there is also stealth involved, or what. And then they have to hit as many waypoints as possible on the way. So it doesn't have to be all of them because they cannot get to their actual goal location within the time bound. So they have to hit as many waypoints as possible. So the question then becomes which UAV takes what waypoints, because either some of those waypoints could be on the way, some of the waypoints could be farther away, in which order, and then you have to also worry about the dynamic constraints, like the minimum radius of UAVs and things like that. So you can formulate that problem, which basically, UAVs with 3.7 goal coordinates, you have the waypoints and so on, and then you can formulate the objective function that basically tells you that the number one criterion is that you want to minimize the number of waypoints that are being left out. So in other words, maximize the number of waypoints that are getting surveillance, the number of waypoints that are getting covered. And then you also, as a secondary condition, you want to minimize the cost of the paths. So in other words, if there are a few waypoints that can be covered by those UAVs, then you want to make sure that all the UAVs follow the least cost paths. So then you can generate plans that look something like that basically allow the UAVs to go through those waypoints and so on. And you can encode the constraints, for example, the turning radius, and you can encode constraints with which they hit those waypoints and so on. Now, the computation, if you look at that problem, it has three kind of main sub-problems. Number one is figuring out the allocation of the waypoint. So that's kind of typical task allocation problem. The number two is figuring out the order in which those UAVs have to visit those waypoints. So once you allocate that this UAV visits waypoint number one and waypoint number two, then the question is in which order they go through it. And number three is figuring out the dynamic physical paths that connect those waypoints. So you can put it all into one single graph, and that will be really big. The alternative to that, and that's kind of the linear decomposition that we've done here, is solving those three problems as separate graph searches. And particularly, like graphically, it looks something like that, where you have the top level waypoint assignment plan, which is basically we construct a graph that represents that problem, and then for every edge that it has to evaluate, you're running a single edge opportunistic planet that figures out how many waypoints that particular UAV can hit and in which order. So it comes out something like that. And then also on the lower level, you have the motion planner running. So the graph that represents the connections between the waypoints and the start position of the UAV. And then you can interleave all of those graph searches in a way that allows you to generate a truly optimal solution with respect to the obviously discrete representation of this problem. Now, I will skip kind of all the details of how you formulate those graph, the cost and the graph representation themselves. Just the main point is that for each of these levels, for each of the graph, you want to make sure that that provides guarantees on the optimality, and then with that you can actually guarantee that the overall graph search, the overall planner finds the solution that is provably optimal, that is minimizes the total number of unvisited waypoints across all the UAVs, and as a secondary condition minimizes the cost of the path of those roads. So with that you can kind of, here's a few examples, like for example here that I showed you earlier for 3 UAVs. You can do more like for the this example, which is 5 UVs and 10 waypoints. Obviously, here we go. This is running on the aerial vehicles. This is aerial vehicles in now postgraduate school, where they basically have been given those 4 waypoints that they have to figure out in real time which waypoints to use them, which for. So I think this is kind of an example of a manual decomposition of the planning problem into a series of graph searches. And as I said before, I think the interesting part, kind of the next step, is how do you take that manual decomposition and go beyond it. In particular, try to figure out how do we find this decomposition automatically. I think part of that is trying to incorporate it within the search, so that as you do the search for the plan, for these robots, you're trying to figure out what is this decomposition, how can you start out with a kind of easy to solve graph searches and gradually increase the complexity of the graph. That kind of translates to the thesis work that one of my students done, Likhachev, and that's called the planning with adaptive conditionality. Now, the example that I will show initially has nothing to do with the multi-robot. It's actually on manipulation. It's easier to talk about it. So if you think about it, here is the robot arm, and it needs to get from one configuration to another. So in particular, you have to get the end effect out there. Then a very simple way to plan for it, which many people have done, is just 3D planning for the end effect. So you basically plan just 3D trajectory, and then you use inverse kinematics to follow that trajectory. That's a couple of very common ways to go around the bottom. And that would work very well here, despite the fact that there's an obstacle, because that particular trajectory is solvable. So you basically, instead of whatever the degree of freedom of that arm is, you're just planning in 3D. Now, if you look at a problem something like that, where the obstacle is much smaller, then you can try to do the same thing, and you will find a trajectory that looks something like that. And the problem lies in that particular region, where there is a full dimensional reasoning is required, because you basically cannot, according to the 3D end effect path, that looks feasible, but according to the full dimensional state space for the robot, for the arm, that is not feasible. And instead, you need to generate a path that looks something like that. So that immediately tells you that kind of in this space here, anywhere except for this region, anywhere else, you just find with a 3D path line. But here, this is where you need to have whatever the 7 degree of freedom, whichever degree of freedom you have for the manipulator. So that is the basic idea, is that you want to start out with a low-dimensional graph search, low-dimensional representation of the problem, and then iteratively search it, and add high-dimensional regions only where it's necessary, and do it in a way that provides guarantees on completeness and boundedness of optimality. So kind of more mathematically, what you have is you have basically some sort of a complex system, and you have 2 projections. In a simplest version, you have 2 projections. One is, not projection, but 2 state spaces. One is the high-dimensional state space, as high, and then you also have a low-dimensional. So it's a low-dimensional projection, and one of the properties that you require is that the costs in the low-dimensional projections are actually lower estimates on the cost in the high-dimensional projections. Now, if you have that, and in very many cases you kind of naturally have that decomposition, where let's say, when you do it, you can look at the end effect, or you can look at the base as a 3D or 2D, and for multi-robots you can also have those decompositions. So if you have that decomposition, then the framework for planning with adaptive dimensionality is there. So it basically starts out with a low-dimensional space, and then it searches that space and finds the path, the least cost path in that space. Then you're constructing the tunnel, full-dimensional tunnel around that space, and then you're searching that tunnel. So it's a full-dimensional tunnel constrained to lie around the low-dimensional path. And then if you're successful, you're done, and you know at this point that you actually generated a solution that is proved optimal due to the fact that you have this constraint on the cost. If you're not done, then you look at where the search failed, and then you introduce a full-dimensional sphere or high-dimensional sphere in that particular place, and you research that graph, which has now becomes a hybrid graph where it's low-dimensional everywhere except that area of where you just introduced the full-dimensional sphere. So here is an example, highly useful task of having the stick move through the window, and it's an 11-dimensional problem where you have to reason about the arm, you have to reason about the base, you have to reason about the mass, and so on. And you start out by a low-dimensional space, which is a 3-dimensional space for the end effector, and you search that first. You find the path that looks something like that, which is a 3-dimensional path, except for the beginning and the end, where you have a full 11 degrees of freedom. Then you construct a tunnel around it, and then you search that tunnel. And then, obviously, you run into a problem that the search gets stuck, and particularly the search fails over here. So it actually, the tunnel proceeds, it finds the path all the way up to that point, and at that point where it fails to find the path forward, that's where you introduce the 11-dimensional sphere there, and you research the hybrid graph. You research that hybrid graph, and you construct another tunnel around that path that you found, and that path now is a 3-dimensional everywhere except for those 3 holes where it is an 11-dimensional segment of a path, and then you continue that fashion, and you basically find a solution which is a full 11-dimensional solution. So you have a full 11 degree of freedom and trajectory. And here is that trajectory still up, obviously. So it's a pretty complex trajectory, obviously, and most of the search that you've done lies in 3D, and you're trying to kind of adjust, follow that path in 3D in 3 dimensions, and then only when you get stuck, you introduce the search in a full 11-dimensional space. Now, this is kind of just the general framework. In reality, the whole thesis was done by Colin on kind of expanding it and doing more complex things and having more decomposition, so it's not just 2 levels, projections, and so on. And as I mentioned before, you actually while doing this, you're maintaining the guarantees in terms of completeness and the constants of optimality. Now, so this is a manipulation. The question is, how does that translate to the robots, in particular heterogeneous robots? Well, I mean, you can actually think of those heterogeneous robots, say those 2 robots like here, as degrees of freedom, and also construct a low-dimensional space that corresponds to them, and have a high-dimensional space that is a full joint state space. And that's exactly what we do here. In this problem, we're basically looking at the problem of collaborative localization, where you have 2 robots. One is this crappy one that can navigate very poorly unless it has a good localization. And it can get a good localization when it sees those markers running on top of that segment. So, if they're both moving together, then it's great, because this guy can localize often. But there are many cases where they can't, and then you have to be planning as to where each one goes, and so on, in order to provide a good localization for you at all times. And here is the movie that shows this. Basically, you have this complex environment with a lot of obstacles, and this area is navigatable by both UAV and UGV. This area can only be flown by UAV because there is actually obstacles that prohibit UGV of going in. And initially they start close to each other, and the UAV needs to fly, I think, in that particular space here. And it can fly pretty well in the hallways because the controls are allowed to hold the wall and so on. But in those open areas, it actually has to have a UGV, namely the SegBot, next to it so that it can localize over it. So in other words, it has to have its markers in its view. So we generate the plan, and I think the plan for a second for this combination. So there's a team of robots that figures out that in this particular case, UGV segment could only stand here, it didn't need to move anywhere else, and UAV was generating that path here that is currently applied, where initially it was staying localized, so it was kind of turning around so that you can always see at all times the marker on the UGV, and then here it's following the whole way, so here it can do a zone. You can see this is actually the way it thinks it is in terms of its own IMU, but because it's using controls that allow it to follow the walls and so on, it actually doesn't get screwed up. So it reaches the goal here, it lands, and then there will be a second experiment in this movie, which is kind of more interesting because you'll see that it will have to, so the UV is over here and it needs to get somewhere over here, and once again, it actually needs to get over here, and this open area, as soon as it hits that open area, it cannot localize on its own, and therefore it needs the UGV to have their localization. So this is the place where you have this full-dimensional state space introduced automatically, and it figures out, as part of that, it figures out that UGV has to go around and position itself in order for the UEV to localize off of a segment. So it follows the whole way. As soon as it enters the open area, that's when it starts localizing off the segment, and it gets to its goal. And I have the last slide. Yeah. So basically, kind of concluding it is, I think the framework of planning and dimensionality that Colin has developed is actually a very interesting one, and we've shown application to two robots, namely in the context of planning for collaborative localization. But other than that, the overall framework is a general framework that is not tailored towards a particular problem. And I think going forward, an interesting question is how you take it and apply it to planning for larger teams of heterogeneous robots, which is in some sense related to M-star work that Glenn Wagner has done, but that work is in the context of multi-robot path planning as opposed to arbitrary multi-robot planning. The other kind of direction of taking that is trying to think about it rather than going for optimal solution, also solutions that are suboptimal just in the context of planning dimensionality. How do you think about when to introduce the additional dimension or not, if there is a lot of freedom in terms of the suboptimality that you can afford? Then the other interesting question is learning a low dimensional spaces from prior experience and doing offline planning. And the one thing that I have not talked about is that the whole idea of just centralized graph searches and kind of decomposing it into a bunch of graph searches actually leads itself pretty well to doing it in the context of intermediate communications. And with that,